We're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. I'm Juliette Wade, and today we're going to talk about naming. And okay, so naming is always super fun, and we have talked about this before. But one of the things that we got talking about when we were talking about the naming stuff last time, we're like, oh, it was so funny because we're like post hangout, and everybody wants to almost start the next hangout right then and there because everybody's so excited. So I took a bunch of notes, but one of the things that really came out of this was that we wanted to talk about the way that people get named throughout our world so that we can explore different kinds of options for character naming other than just first name, last name, because first name and last name are actually culturally bound conventions that that you don't necessarily have to stick with. So we're going to try to go a little bit further afield today and talk about how people get named and what other things you can do. Let's see. So, for example, one of the things that came up is while in the U.S. we have a sense that there is such a thing as a first name and a last name, there are places in the world where you only have one name. And it's not a nickname, it's just your name, right? So I believe that was Indonesia. Some people just have one name. Not everyone, but some, right? And then you also have places in the world, like, for example, Japan, where what we would consider the first name actually comes second. And what we would consider the last name actually comes first. So family name comes first, and then personal name second. And actually, so then you have patronymics, people who get named after their parents. And sometimes they're named after their dads, and sometimes that's what patronymics means, but sometimes they're named after their moms, right? Sometimes daughters will be named after their moms, and there are different naming traditions. So I'm thinking, yeah. So anyways, it's hard not to just sort of instantly digress into like every single one of these possible things. But so just to list a couple more options, there are some social groups that share all the same last name. And I'm thinking off the top of my head first about the Sikh religion, and how men of the Sikh religion have the last name Singh. And women, I think, have a different one. And now I'm not thinking of it because my brain is on the fritz. But I can, yep. Google is my friend. Kaur, I don't know if I'm saying that right. K-A-U-R, name used by Sikh women either as a middle or last name. Anyway, so yes, so there are all these different naming traditions.
I found the wiki for North America. And it says, many Hispanophones in the countries of Hispanic America have two given names plus a paternal surname and a maternal surname. So yep. You get like something like 5 or 6 names. I'll just copy that
I will give you an example of somebody that I know. She's from Mexico City. Her name is Claudia Roxana Chavez Diaz. Right? Yep. And Claudia Roxana is her first her two given names, and then Chavez was her paternal surname, and Diaz was her maternal surname, and that was her name, right? And then you have all these other, like, for example, British royalty will have like all kinds of names. And I'm not even sure of what the significance of all the extra names is. But they will have lots of given names.
I feel like that one is like say like, okay, you know how like you get like names of racehorses where it's like 500 names long because it's like the entire lineage of that racehorse.
Yeah,
contained with. I almost feel like be how it is with British royalty, although I'm sure Brian would just like smack that one down.
Brian probably would, but
he would know. He would know.
I mean, any of these things that we can go and look into more on our own, you know, just to make sure that we know exactly what the basis of this is. But yeah, so people, I am noticing. I was going to say a minute ago, and I think this is relevant because we've been talking about paternal surnames, maternal surnames, and names that invoke one's lineage, right? There are a lot of traditions of naming after, right? In the world. And so, for example, my daughter's middle name is the same as my mom's first name, right? Oh, and by the way, some people have middle names and some don't.
And one question is, what is first name and what is middle name and what is you know, last name? Those are easy. If you have three names, then it's obviously by position. But what is the purpose of the names? Because I know someone who says, you know, that she has two first names, you know, but they come in a specific order. What is it makes something a first name even when it's not in the first position?
Word order is very important in language just generally, right?
Yeah.
And so name order is very important too. And in fact, and I think in a way, I mean, you've got all of these stories, particularly fantasy stories, where knowing something's name is really super, super important, right? I'm thinking of Ursula Le Guin's Earth-Sea trilogy, where knowing something's name is really important. Or I'm thinking of Patricia McKillip's the Fantastic Beasts of Eld, I believe. So no, it's not. Maybe not Fantastic. The Forgotten Beasts of Eld.
There are a lot of traditions, and I couldn't name you the other places that I've seen them where the true name of something is important. And actually, if you look at just bureaucracy in the real world, knowing your true name, knowing and true name, legal name, you know.
Now you're making me think of. Now you're making me think of writing a story that would be science fiction, but would be based on this concept of knowing the true name allows you to control a thing via the magic power of bureaucracy.
Yeah, that's true. But it's not fiction.
No,
because I mean, just look at voter ID laws. Where they say you have to, the name you give has to match this name you've already given. And then, you know, the question of you know, transgender people and their names.
How many people share names? This connects to what I was saying about naming after a little while ago. I'm thinking of people that, like, I know there's a young man of my kid's acquaintance who is Charles Kelso V. Right? Some families have the tradition of naming the firstborn male after the dad. Right?
I know of a man who he had, I think, 7 kids. And he named his oldest kid, his oldest son, after himself.
Mm-hmm.
He also named his youngest child, his youngest son, after himself. They were, it's, not the circumstance where the older child died and he felt the need to try again. They were
Yeah.
both living kids.
Yeah.
He just
Well, I mean,
decided to do that.
yeah. Then you've got George Foreman, who named every single one of his kids, boy or girl, after himself.
Oh yeah, I forgot about his sort of, yeah. But this guy was, I guess he
That
was unique in
complicates
his own
things
way.
and certainly leads to nicknaming. You've got
Mhm.
systematic nicknaming for disambiguation kind of stuff going on in a family where multiple generations or multiple siblings have the same name.
Mhm.
I did some research into Jewish names.
Mhm.
Yep.
For a book that keeps getting pushed farther and farther, but I keep thinking about. And apparently, like you name kids after, I think it was only deceased relatives. You can't name them after anyone living.
Certainly, the Ashkenazi tradition is you don't no living people. You don't do that.
Yeah. So
And
they
in
have
fact,
to be named
isn't
after
it
deceased
that you
relatives
have to
only.
match the first letter of the name, but not the entire name?
That one I don't know. I don't
That
think the website went into that.
I'm not sure that either.
It could be maybe that you only can use the whole name if it's anyway, but I don't know the details of this, but I know of some kids who were named after like their grandmother, but in fact they don't actually have the full grandmother's name. They have a name that starts with the same letter as the grandmother's name.
Yeah. Well, our kid is named after my deceased mother-in-law and my deceased. She wasn't my mother, but we were close, and I was the closest thing that she had to a daughter, and it's not, neither name was Hebrew, but we chose the Hebrew name that had the closest meaning to
And you know
that. They shared a name. They had the same name, these women.
Yeah.
And we chose
There
the
are
Hebrew name
also
closest meaning.
thank you for saying it in that way, because I'm thinking there are also several different traditions of having a religious name.
Yes, I have a Hebrew name as well as my English name. My child does
Have a
not.
name in another. I mean, you can have a name in another language, or you can have a name that's associated like with a religion, like Hebrew name. Like I'm thinking of people who have Chinese names and then who adopt American names as they come to the U.S.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's also because like American.
Probably a tradition started by missionaries in China.
Certainly could be, yeah.
Well, I know that occurred in missionary context because the missionaries couldn't pronounce Chinese and they just didn't even try. They were like, "You are now Elizabeth."
Yeah,
and that was done
like
to
missionaries anywhere.
That was done to a lot of people.
Yeah, and in Ellis Island, it happened to a lot of people too.
Yep. And for the strangest reasons, my great grandmother probably hesitated when she came in and was giving her 6 kids names. So I'm looking at the paperwork and I know my grandmother's name was Mildred. So why does it say Emily on it? And probably this exhausted woman who is on a ship crossing the Atlantic Ocean with 5 kids, of whom the oldest was 11, And by the time she gets to this guy standing in line, she must be like, Millie. And
Yeah.
so the bored guy is just writing down, Millie, Emily.
Yeah.
Really, dude? This woman
And
is
you know,
towing.
sometimes they were just like, well, I'm not going to write down that thing because I can't even spell it. So I'm just going to write down what I feel like.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
You know, so
I'm not going to take the effort to see you as a human being and learn your name.
Yeah. And I think, in fact, that's a really important aspect of naming is that having respect for somebody's name. There is that sense that your name is who you are, right? And that there is disrespect for who you are if there's disrespect for your name. I don't think that's wrong.
I don't think it's wrong. There's also in some places, not to pick on religion, but because I don't have a problem with religion, I have a problem with the practice of some people of beating children who were named Jesus until they said, "Oh no, my name is Tim now," because I don't feel like you beating me every time I say my name is Jesus.
Wow.
Oh, you mean like oh, I was gonna say like in Roots where they're like they changed his name to like Toby and like whipped him until he said his name was Toby.
Yeah, but that was it's a different issue.
Okay.
I'm because none of the Africans were going to say yes, my name is Jesus.
Yeah, no.
okay.
But
But we got a lot of Jesuses when like in California.
yeah, because you're allowed to, because one religious tradition is, you know, I don't know if this is actually their religious tradition or if it's just a name to some people, but they'll use that name in with respect and on honor of, you know, for the same reason you'd name a girl Mary or Maria or whatever. But for English speaking, apparently that's a no. You can't name your kid that use that name.
Well, you know, it was never a problem with Mary.
Yeah, well, you know, women. Now I'm going to be cynical. Now I'm going to be cynical. But that's, you know, those are differences in what's allowed by religions.
Yeah, sure.
My kid does not have a separate Hebrew name. The only name my kid has is their Hebrew names. Just,
yeah,
you know, what we call a first and middle name. But there's also, and I don't know if it's currently the case in Israel because I haven't looked. You'll use ben or bar or bat to indicate the relationship, the parentage.
Yeah.
So it would be Benjamin Ben. Well, actually, that's kind of a strange choice.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
Azrael Ben Bar Abraham.
Right. So that I guess is sort of indicating who your father was.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So we have, and I think I'm glad that you brought up these naming techniques. I guess techniques that that indicate relationships between people, because I've seen those in many science fictional and fantasy contexts as well, where people will be named for their parent or for the land where they came from, etc. And in fact, those kinds of things can actually be very, very problematic if there is a stigma attached to whoever your parent was or whatever land you came from. That can kind of stick to you and become a real problem for you socially. but you also, and then see, there's too many things going through my head. But
I know in my family, if you go far enough back, it's just everybody's either an Olafson or a Halverson. It's kind of like they just switch back and forth. Halvar Oleson, Ole Halverson, back 8 generations, and it's like, how in the world would you ever tell any of them apart? In fact, I know my husband's grandfather, when he moved to this country, there were too many people with the same last name as him because of that, because he's also Scandinavian. And so he ended up giving himself the last name of the farm he had come from. So that's kind of they're the first people with that last name. So I always know if you find someone with that last name, my husband's related to them.
Wow. Can you write down those names in the chat bar so I can see what they look like?
Okay, well.
I also want to remark that how those names that end in son kind of manifest themselves depends on which region you're from. So sometimes it's SEN and sometimes it's SON, and then you have Iceland where you have SON, and then you have daughter for the young women.
Mm-hmm.
And it made for a really lovely viewing experience when we were watching the Icelandic handball team play in the Olympics. Because, Edmundsdóttir passes to Ólafsdóttir, and it was awesome. I was like, wow. It was like having my eyes open to a whole new way of naming people right there in the Olympics, which was super fun. Yeah. Oh, I was really close, actually. Yeah, it would be really tricky if you had two names that just alternated generations.
Well, and you're not, of course, the owners of a name like Ole or Halvar, right? So everybody else in the neighborhood is naming their kids the same thing, or in the next town over, and then they all immigrate to this part of the country, and yeah, there's 3 or 4 of them. Their mail gets messed up. They get the bad reputation of one of the other ones who did something wrong. At that point in time, they're all like, I am done with my ancestral way of naming myself. I'm going to pick something different so I can differentiate myself from these other people.
Well, there are these social pressures to disambiguate, for example. And I think honestly, it's worth noting that in fiction itself provides an artificial pressure to disambiguate, right? Mm-hmm. Because how many people do we know who have the same name? Like, I bet you guys know a lot of guys named David.
Oh dear God, yes. and here's
couple.
I have a story about David's and Jonathan's and Keith's. There were 4. I mean, just in this one social group, I think there were 4 guys whose first name was David at one of the schools I went to. And there was, let's see, Dave, D3, DTK or something like that. And then there was the guy who said, who was D Keith. That was what he went by, D Keith. And I think he later dropped the initial D, once he was out of school and living an adult life.
Just became Keith.
And just became Keith. And at about the same time that happened, this guy I knew, whose first name was Jonathan, who didn't want to be John or Jonathan, his middle name was Keith. And so, while he's in college with all these other Johns and Jonathans, and his best friend's name is John, he became Keith. And, they're fine in their respective groups because now they don't have the same name as everybody around them. And I'm just sitting there going, thanks, guys. That's very helpful.
Well, it's funny because sometimes you don't want to be that person. Like, I mean, so in my dad's family, they gave both my let's see, my grandpa's name was Robert Lee Tanner, and my dad was named Robert Michael Tanner, and so Grandpa went by Bob, and my dad went by Michael, because he didn't want to also be Robert or Bob, right? But you know, it is interesting how much nicknaming you have to do, or how much choice of middle name you have to do in order to disambiguate yourself from other people with your same name. So I was going to say, but the fiction pressure is to have all names be unique within the context of your book.
Right.
Right.
Never did it. Oh, you read his historical fiction, everyone has the same name.
Right. Well, and why would he have?
Yes.
Right? I mean, because he was naming people for
real people.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of people have the same names, right?
Yeah.
I'm Henry VIII. I am.
Yep.
Yeah.
So having all the names unique in your book is actually helpful in some ways. But so I'm up against something with my books where I want to have this concept of name lines, and name lines are actually not genetic name lines, but they're, there are these names that are out there, and they have a particular sort of semantic significance. And so if you want to invoke that semantic historical significance for your child, you pick that name for them. And I'm helping myself by saying, well, in any given generation, you really only want to have that name one time, right? But at the same time, it means there's going to be more than one. There's going to be more than one person who has a particular name. Also, it's worth noting that there are traditions of, like, for example, when you hear a name, you can often guess what ethnic group that person comes from. Now, we already talked about how if you're a member of the Sikh religion and you're a man, your last name tends to be Singh. It also happens, though, in other cultural subgroups. So there are names that feel African-American in the United States, for example, or there are names that will mark you as being a member of a particular religious group, like, say, Mormons. I mean, but basically naming traditions leave their stamp on the population, right? And so they can become ways for people to be marked relative to one another. And I've mentioned that previously in this hangout, but I think it's actually worth engaging with that question in fiction, because it's like, here are these names that are traditionally associated with a particular social group. That should be happening in whatever world it is that you're designing. I mean, I'm assuming that there are social groups in your world, right? Yeah. So it's worth thinking about, well, are these social groups in my world going to have names that are traditional for them, right? And of course they will, because, it only makes sense. That's what happens in the real world.
Yeah.
So,
but I do know that like one of my students who's East Indian, we were watching a television show for a literature segment of the film segment of the class, and the character was named Amy Pallavi. So the last name was East Indian, but she was actually quite happy to see a first name that wasn't, deliberately pushed into the East Indian language and culture, just because that's very typical from her, several generations already been Canadian, that her family, she and her sister both actually do have Indian name, but they actually liked seeing occasionally not so, like a name that didn't actually come from her culture. And I know that I think of Indigenous people, a lot of them just would prefer people who are not Indigenous writing about them just stick with the kinds of names that they run around in public with, and their private names, they don't come into fiction.
Yeah.
Well, we're talking earlier about family being being important, and relationships, and a naming structure that I have for one of my social cultural groups is that there were different words for child and parent and spouse. So if you're talking about, and for the perspective of the conversation, the context of the conversation is important. So if you're talking about Counselor Ngartha, and when his boss talks to him, instead of saying counselor, he says, shoot, what is the name? I don't know what the word is, but Flente, whatever the word I came up with is, Ngartha. What he means is, dude, I got to talk to you about your kid. I'm talking to you as the parent of this individual, not in your capacity as my advisor. And I wish that I could remember what the name was, what the word was that I came up with. So that's that is a thing to use to denote the context of a conversation. And Shays is used by something.
It's the chapter is, as I was thinking about, like how like names and respect, and how what you name a pet versus what you name people, and how, you know, like you wouldn't necessarily name your kid what you would name a dog, right? So there's separate, you know, like there are no peoples named Rover, really.
Well, I have two stories about that, actually.
But Juliet has a story about that.
So I'm going to tell you both of the stories. The first one was, and this is in the chat bar, my dad was once introduced to a family and their dog, and one of the names he was given was Duke. And he assumed that it was the dog, but it was actually one of the sons, and he was really embarrassed, right? Because in his mind, Duke was just not a human person's name. But so, you know, this family had named their kid Duke. Okay, right? I think partly, I mean, I don't know if this was around the same time, but my dad's family had a dog at one point, and her name was Duchess. So I mean, I can see how there was a problem there. But in fact, there was another situation where my husband, is the last of 5 kids, and so they asked the kids what they wanted to name the baby, and they basically came down to, well, it was either going to be Tim or Sam, but then they got a dog and they named it Sam. So I guess that means that the baby has to be Tim. Like,
Sam
so
is
my husband, actually, his middle name is Samuel, so he ended up almost having the same name as the dog.
Sam is a good and popular name for a dog. Our dog was named Sam, and dog my dog Keith had growing up was named Sam.
I mean, naming animals is another whole raft of issues, right?
But I mean, like, okay, isn't this is what I remember from Japanese class, and you'll know better, Juliet, but that there are sort of specific Japanese dog names that are not used for people. Is that?
Well, so you do have this, I don't know that much about naming dogs in Japan, but I do know that, for example, French has these nicknames. Like you were talking about Rover, right? Spot is another name for dog that's very, very common, right? And in fact, I think Kerberos means spotted. Like Cerberus, the guardian of hell, his name is Spot.
Yeah.
His name is Spot, yes.
Nice.
So like
Hey, he's a dog.
Is a really traditional dog name. Back to the ancient times. And you know, Rover, yeah, I mean, right. But so okay, so let's talk about in French. I don't know if you guys have ever read Tintin.
Oh, yeah.
His dog's name was Snowy in English, but in French it was Milou. And it's spelled M-I-L-O-U. But Milou is actually like the quintessential dog name in French. And if you run into just some random dog on the street, you might call it Milou just because it's a dog. It's like us, you know, saying, here, kitty, kitty, kitty. Right?
Yeah.
But there is also a traditional cat name, and it's Minou, which is the same.
I had a friend named Minou.
But with an N, and that is for cats. So, yeah, so if you run into the name Milou, it is going to be a dog in French. And if you run into the name Minou, it is going to be a cat. Which I also think is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh gosh, and then there are names with messages. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So people named after virtues, I guess, right?
Well, not even. You know, I'm actually I'm thinking about the old Puritan names that were actually literally sermons in names. So sometimes, yes, you would be named after a virtue like honor or chastity or charity or something like that. But also, Job raked out of the ashes. Has descendants. Fly fornication, that's a great one. Introduce yourself like that in kindergarten.
Wow, yeah.
Where did you find these?
You just do a search for strange Puritan names on the internet, and you'll find just hours of amusement.
Wow.
So these people hated their children.
These are gold, man.
Yeah.
Because, seriously.
Well, and you know what? And J.K. Rowling in Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them was invoking the Puritans, right? With the names of the anti-witch group in New York. I'm trying to think of what the main kid's name was. Oh, darn it. I'm gonna go look it up.
I can't stand it.
Nuts.
But I think, if you're coming up with fictional characters' names, one of the things that I've tried to do, because I'm writing a story that's set in 2015, which is now feeling like historical fiction, but it was. But when I'm looking to name a character, I usually do a Google search for the name I've chosen until I don't get any responses. So I will keep changing out the name until there is nobody on the internet, at least, who has the same name as my character.
Yeah.
And that was particularly important for me when I was working with naming an indigenous character, whose home is on a reserve, and it's a very tiny nation. I mean, everybody knows everybody, and they have, so names would be very important there. So I went into ethnographies. I found a name that was part of that culture, but that no longer seems to exist as part of the current people who are living in that nation, and used that last name for my character, just to make sure that it was both authentic to her nation, but not one that any longer had a presence or in the communities, so that she would not be connected to anyone actually literally living.
That's interesting.
But here's a question that I may be sort of not something you want to think about. Why do names fall out of use? Is it just sometimes they just fall out of fashion, they're old fashioned.
Well, I mean, I think fashion is a huge thing, right?
But why do you see so few children named Adolf, for example?
Okay.
No, I had a great uncle whose name was Adolf. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there is that
infamy.
thing where association with a particular bad or good person will influence naming.
Yeah, you want to live your life so that people don't mind naming their children your name.
Well, so for example, I would never have named a child of mine Susie because I just had bad luck with Susies. right? I mean, like,
Yeah, but that is
But historical names come in and out too. You know, nobody names their children Gertrude.
Genocide or anything, but like it happens.
Names them who, Patsy?
Gertrude. You know, it used to be a popular name. It would have a nickname of Trudy.
Yeah,
you know, so names will change because of time. You know, people don't, you know, the names start to sound old-fashioned, and people don't want to name their kids old-fashioned things. But then there's like you say, there are historical reasons why some names will go out too.
Well, and you know, then you have old names that come back, like Abigail is now back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, for a while it was, oh, well, that, you know, sounds like my grandma's name, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so once a generation has passed out of the world, then those names are sort of free to be reused, where you're not going to be associating them with people's grandmas, I guess. You know.
There's also like the opposite, which is like Hollywood children names.
Well, okay, so let's talk for a second about making up names.
Bananas. And there probably is literally a kid named Banana out there.
Well, there are kids named Apple and Moon Unit. Yeah. And I mean, there are all kinds of kids out there, and people name their kids different things.
Hashtag. I think somebody actually named their kid Hashtag.
There's a family in my community. They are Eastern European. I'm not sure from where, but their language is not English, and so for them, they've named their kids names in English that no one who's native speaker of English would ever name their kids. So they've got a son named Reef and a daughter named Ocean, and all of them are named like sea names, but Harbor. You know, just they're just a little bit different than somebody who actually is a native English speaker would name their child, but I'm
not sure that's even
like that
versus non-native issue, because there are communities where naming your kids after different kinds of stuff is actually relatively
Hollywood.
I mean,
I want to say Hollywood.
It's just less obvious.
Nautica, that's another one.
There are communities where making up the name of your child is actually totally normal. And there are other communities where you really, really should be picking from this pool of names that are valid for reasons.
I think these people would be right at home in Hollywood with their naming. This is just a little tiny itsy bitsy town in the middle of central Alberta, so it's just a little odd here.
Yeah,
but there's actually a much more of a tradition of making up names in the African American community, for example, than there is in certain other communities that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
And then there's sort of left wing hippie kinds of making up names. I mean, so
right.
But if it happens in lots of different contexts, and for different reasons, right? I mean, unique is actually a really common name in the African American community, right? Which I think is kind of funny just because of what unique means, but at the same time it's kind of a cool name because everybody is.
Yeah. But that's one of the reasons I think that people do make up names is because, well, okay, look at my last name, my legal name, Smith. So one of the reasons that my kid is named the way that they are is because there is no other person in their class with that first name.
Yeah.
Since this area, it's not just a common name, it's a common name in this area that we live in. So that is a reason that people just will use unusual names or bring names back in to use that have fallen out of use, or just make up names.
Right. And then there's the nerdy community. They make up names or they borrow them from literature.
Oh God, yeah, I did. There's like a whole slew of kids now named after like Game of Thrones.
Well, and you know what? Do you remember when Splash came out?
Oh,
I remember Splash.
Right.
Yeah,
when
I saw that.
Came out, you had that scene where Tom Hanks and Daryl Hannah are walking down the street and he's going, "What's your name?" We can't really use that name that you use to break the TVs in the store. So what do you want me to call you? And she picks out the name off a street sign, which, it doesn't make any sense that she would be able to read, but that's okay.
But no, that's not why she did that. That's not why she did that, because at the same time they're having that discussion, he is trying to figure out where they are.
Well,
so
that's
he's
right.
reading the street names.
I remember that.
He's
read
reading
the
the street names. And
Where
and
are
he-
we? Madison. And she's like, Madison, that sounds like a good name. Now, since
he's
then,
like, but no.
tons of young women are named Madison, right?
And after other things that were named after streets, but also Madison Avenue is named after a person.
Yeah, James Madison, right?
Yeah, last name.
It was a last name.
Yeah. But
I
then
honestly
becomes a first
think,
name.
no, but I mean, yes, it's a person's name, but let's be fair. I think that the slew of young women named Madison was actually directly influenced by the existence of the movie Splash.
Oh, that I'm not questioning that.
No, so but that was my point. You can have these big, giant shared cultural narratives that create a sort of an atmosphere for a name that then people want to invoke.
Yeah.
When they name children or.
It's an interesting thread to follow backwards, though, I think. But naming people things like ocean in English is funny to us because it's in English. But if you go to somebody who's named something, sometimes you'll say, well, what does your name mean? And it only looks funny to us because, there are people who are named ocean, but it doesn't look funny because it's in a different language.
Right, exactly. And we expect names not to be literal, but if you actually go back to Tolkien and you look at the names of the different elves, all the elves have literal names in Elvish.
Oh. Well, I don't know Elvish, so
I think it's actually.
But I mean, we don't speak Elvish, but if you actually go back, you can actually parse the names of all the elves in Tolkien into the Elvish language that he created. So their names mean very literal things.
Yeah.
I think actually probably it's more common for names to be supposed to mean something than the English tendency to try not to mean something.
Well, there was, I mean, there are, like, if you go to the baby name sites and you look up, like, oh, what does Michael mean? There is a meaning. Michael actually does mean something.
But it's in another language.
Peter means rock.
English.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The French version of Peter is Pierre, and Pierre means rock. That literal word is the word for rock in French.
Wow.
But Peter is also the word for rock. It's in Petrus. It's
exactly.
So that's what I'm saying is a lot of English names, they mean something in other languages, but not in English.
Yeah. So actually, what was I going to say? Darn it. Well, it fled my head. That's okay. Yeah, so a lot of names are little. Oh, yes, what I was going to say. Okay, so let's think about for a second about surnames. And a lot of surnames are literal, like shoemaker.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, my favorite is Fuller.
The name Tanner is literal.
Fuller is my favorite because it was like the worst job ever.
Fuller.
Well, probably not the worst
Fletcher,
job.
For example, Fletcher is a great name, but when we don't think about arrow making, right?
Yeah.
But that was totally what Fletcher's did, right? So there are those literal last names in English. And then you've got a very interesting thing that happened in Japan, which is, I think, worth mentioning before we wrap up, which is that for a long time, the only people who had family names were the samurai. And then at a certain point, it was like, well, everybody kind of needs to have a last name. And so people got named for where they lived. And so all of a sudden you have Tanaka, which means the middle of the rice paddy. And then you have Matsushita, underneath the pine tree, right? And you have, so you have all these names that are actually have literal meanings, right? Kawaguchi, the mouth of the river, right? So we think
Townsend,
being non-literal, but at the same time, they're often literal.
It happens in English too. Townsend and Hill.
Yep. Underhill.
Here's a question. Where people named Underhill come from? I mean, is it at the bottom of the mountain, or the foothills?
I thought they came from the Shire.
There's that, but there's also the Fae.
Yeah.
Don't they live under the hill?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
So maybe somebody's got yes, Fae ancestry.
Fairy blood.
Yep.
It was just a thought, but there's house names, not just family names, but family names, like the one people, the House Ankuta. And then there's a character who had a perfectly good family name. Where is he? Niko. Sir, I forget what it was. This is terrible. I'm really bad at that. But when he took a job basically with the government as a spy or an investigator, they changed his house name. They said, this isn't your house anymore. Now your name is Sara Ukano.
This isn't your thing.
You're disconnecting you from your family and telling you your loyalty is now to us, and not to your family.
Yeah. Well, in my foreign world, there are caste names, and caste names basically tell you what jobs you are expected to do and what your values are expected to be. So they're not family names. They're an indication of all sorts of cultural expectations for you as a human being, right?
Right.
But they are shared with lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of people. And there aren't any really family names per se, right? And then in the Varn world, the caste name comes first, so that everybody knows who you are first and what your expectations are supposed to be first, and then your individuality is indicated second, right?
Right.
And it's perfectly normal for people to refer to another person whose name they do not know as just by caste name, because you're legally required to wear a mark that indicates your caste. So it's very simple just to, identify a person and say, well, this person is obviously, wearing the caste mark of the Mbati or whatever it is. And so I can just refer to them as Mbati, and that is polite.
Right.
And the difference between, well, if I'm a higher caste than them, I would just call them Mbati. And if I were lower caste than them, I would call them Mbati, sir. Right?
Right.
But there's no particular, there's no stigma. It's just sort of, this is who you are. It's a sort of an identity marker. But I wanted to put it first because that's considered to be the most important thing about you in this society. So.
Right.
I've seen some fun naming things in some of the books I've read. There's a group of people who's, every time you perform some kind of accomplishment, you added a syllable to your name. So you could tell the really super accomplished and older people by the longer and longer their names got. And then another culture where your name was basically your resume. And so they always thought human beings with their tiny little names were very unaccomplished, because it should take you 15 minutes to say your whole name.
Yeah.
That's pretty awesome. Well, you know what? It's after 11. This is a very, very rich topic. So I hope that we covered some things that we haven't covered before, and I think we got into a lot of really interesting kinds of stuff. There's always room to go back and return to a topic like this, because hey, there's always more. But
I found the term that I came up with
next week.
in the chat box.
is the 30th, which means we're going to be having a guest author. I am going to be confirming with him in the next couple of days. Alec Navala Lee is going to be here to talk about his work, and that should be super fun. So, hey, be here because it's going to be awesome. And I look forward to seeing you next week. And we'll stop the broadcast.